All right, so Luke 13. We're hanging out in Luke 13, and if you want to have a Bible in front of you as we work our way through the passage, you can do that. Pull out your phone or your tablet, whatever it is. Either I'll assume you're texting other people who are watching on YouTube, which is totally fine, or reading along with us. But again, I always think it's good for you to have it in front of you, and so Luke 13, we're going to start reading in and around verse 10. In a couple minutes. But like we saw on the Family Time video, this is a story about Jesus healing. It is a story about Jesus healing a woman who was crippled, who was bent over and couldn't stand up straight. And it's a story of Jesus healing on the Sabbath. And so we're going to hopefully lean into a little bit of all of those things. And as I was reflecting on this passage and reading and preparing this message, it got me thinking a little bit about the fact that I'm born in a strange generation. And maybe everybody has to reconcile with that or think about or kind of wrestle with that reality of when they are born, like each of us. And so maybe I'm standing up here and saying I was born in a strange generation, and every single one of you could equally say that about yourselves. But I am part of what feels, anyways, like a generation caught in between a moment. I'm like a middle-aged millennial. And then when I said that to Connie, she's like, no, you're an old millennial. You're an old millennial. And so I was born in the 80s, but the late 80s. I grew up in the 90s before computers. I remember a time before we owned a computer. I remember what it was like to not have a cell phone. I remember what it was like for my parents when we were playing outside and it was dinner time to have to open the door, stand on the porch, and yell that it was time to come back for dinner. And if I didn't come home, which was not uncommon, they would yell louder, or they would just go eat dinner and put mine in the fridge, right? I remember what it was like to get my first cell phone, only it wasn't like a supercomputer like they are now. It was a little flip phone that flipped open, and the antenna extended out the top. Like, I remember all of those things. I remember what it was like for our family to get our first computer and for us to have access to the internet at home. And like at each of those moments, I can remember not having and then having. So this in-between generation. But the reality is I've also now spent the majority of my life, like the vast majority now, using technology and living with its ramifications, the good and the bad, living with its consequences, learning how to use it. It is now natural for me when I don't know something to Google it. And I know for others, that's not always the first response. Some of you probably know exactly what I'm talking about. Others, maybe less so. I also remember what it was like for things to be closed on Sunday. Who remembers those days? Yeah. And I remember the distinct shift when things began to be open on Sunday, at least majority open rather than majority closed. Many of you probably remember these shifts in culture. And so today, what we are going to talk about is the Sabbath. And hopefully, maybe, we're going to tap in for some of you to those pieces of nostalgia, maybe for others not so. But I want to say, this isn't a sermon about making an argument for why we should return to those days. It's not a moment for us to pine for like the good old days and just say, hey, listen, in the past everybody was better. In the past everybody was more spiritual. In the past everybody went to church. Like in the past everybody was a better Christian, because that's not always true. But this is a sermon about the Sabbath. It is a sermon about rest. And so I want us to pay attention to that dynamic as we read through the passage that was already portrayed for us on the screen. It's, again, the story of Jesus healing a crippled woman on the Sabbath. So in verse 10, on a Sabbath, Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues, and a woman was there. She had been crippled by a spirit for 18 years. She was bent over and could not straighten up. When Jesus saw her, he called her forward and said to her, "Woman, you are set free from your infirmity." Then he put his hands on her, and immediately she straightened up and praised God. I promise we're going to get to more than just the first 3 words. But I want to talk a little bit about those first 3 words, on a Sabbath. Sabbath is a practice. It is something that you do, but it is also something that takes practice. Because at the end of the day, I don't think that it is something that we are naturally good at. Resting intentionally toward God is not necessarily something that is built into every single one of our rhythms, our weekly rhythms. But the reality is that many of us long for this lost art of practicing Sabbath without even realizing it. Because I think that you can, when you really think about it, recognize that the pace of life we've adopted as normal in the West is a little bit problematic. Now listen, I'm not saying it's not good to work. It is. It is good to work. In fact, Sabbath actually points toward the goodness of occupation and meaningful work. But I'm also saying that it's important to have those moments where we, just as intentionally as we step into work, also intentionally step into rest. We think that rest is something we can do later in life. Maybe we see rest as weak. Maybe we think sleep can wait. But I want to ask you a question, and this was a question that I was just wrestling with even this weekend as I was doing my chores and running around and working yesterday. When was the last time that you collapsed into the weekend after a busy week, rested, only to then feel tired and maybe even more so on Monday morning? Yeah. I think many of us live with chronic fatigue. But it's not just in and because of the way you act or I act. It's because of the way we have constructed culture and society. But it's also because of the way we are acted on by external forces. When was the last time you visited a place with no billboards, no ads, no commercials? My kid, 4 years old, can already tell now the difference. If we're watching something on YouTube and an ad pops up, she'll say, "Hey, Dad, is this an ad?" And I'm like, 4 years old, probably time to stop watching YouTube. There are some paces and things in life that act on us. People trying to purchase your attention and your affection, people trying to persuade you to purchase a product. The world that we have constructed as normal is just simply busy. I realized this again when recently we went to a restaurant. And so as things have been opening, my family's been fairly cautious, but in this last sort of wave of things opening up, we went out to a restaurant for the first time. And what I realized in that moment was it was nostalgic for Connie and I, and even Anna. She knew the memory that she had before the pandemic of going to a restaurant, and so it was exciting and it was familiar. But for Evelyn, my daughter who was born during the pandemic, it wasn't just unfamiliar, it was downright foreign. She had never been to a restaurant before. And so I remember when we went in and sat down, she was just almost in shock. Because there was just too many sources, too many factors, too many things acting on her, trying to grab her attention. And so there was us, her family. We were trying to interact with her and talk to her, but there were also all these other families around. And she kept looking and jumping up on the seats and peering over and trying to talk to these other people. And not only that, but there were TVs on, and so there was noise, and there was music playing, which was also loud. And at every turn, she was just sat there, and eventually, we had to, pick her up and get the check and just take her back out to the car because she got too overwhelmed by the whole experience. Flash forward a few weeks to yesterday, we went to a restaurant again, and it was like she had always been there. She got used to it that fast. And so it's startling to me. And maybe just as a parent, seeing the world through now the lens and the eyes of my kids who are experiencing things for the first time, how problematic some of the things are that we have built. And so how quickly we become used to all of that noise, all of that stuff that is inputting and acting on our lives. The Sabbath was designed to intentionally push against all of that. The Sabbath was designed and created to bring life to creation. It's about resting before God in the face of all these things. It is about choosing to turn our lives, to turn our minds, to turn our hearts, and to turn our actions toward God and rest before God. To step out of the mode of production, to step out of work, to step out of a fast pace of life and intentionally slow down. It's about worship. Eugene Peterson, and I've used this quote before, says that the Sabbath is designed to play and to pray. That's a great quote because it's easy to remember. You play, you enjoy life, you rest, you do the things that are life-giving, and you do them before God with a spirit and a mindset of prayer. You turn your heart and you pray before a God who created you to enter into these life-giving rhythms. In Genesis 2, the story of creation, this is the invitation into Sabbath, that first invitation into rest. So this is at the end of creation. It says, "Thus the heavens and earth were completed in their vast array. Everything is created. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done." And it's really easy for us to read that and think, okay, great, that means we work like crazy for 6 days and then we rest for one. But there's something that happens in the Genesis narrative of creation that I think is so instrumental. God works, and this is important, God works for 6 days. Creates humanity, creates human beings, and then doesn't say, go and work and earn your rest. He invites humanity into his rest. It is earned for you based on the work of God. And that's the rhythm that God wants to continually invite us into. The Sabbath is about breathing life into the world. But like so many things, when it bumps up against humanity and bumps up against religion, bumps up against rules, Sabbath is also something that we see throughout Scripture and even in our own lives that became much more about adhering to the letter of the law than about the spirit in which it was given, than about the life that it was intended to call you into. The law was always intended to bring life, but unfortunately, it's also something that we see used as a tool to control and to subdue. And so with all of that, that's sort of the background to Jesus stepping into this moment and healing this woman on the Sabbath. Enter Jesus, right, who shows up and starts healing, which is perceived by the Pharisees, by those in charge of the temple, of the synagogue, as sinful. Because Jesus is breaking, in their eyes, he is breaking the letter of the law. Only probably more importantly to the point, the Pharisees' understanding and application of the law. So the law, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy, became something that was much more about laws and following meticulously than it was about the spirit, the why behind the law that was given. And so I want to continue reading in verse 14. So the woman has just been healed in 13, and in 14, these are the responses that we start to see. Indignant, because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, the synagogue leader said to the people, "There are 6 days for work, so come and be healed on those days, not on the Sabbath." The Lord answered him, "You hypocrites, doesn't each of you on the Sabbath untie your ox or donkey from the stall and lead it out to water? Then should not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has kept bound for 18 years long, be set free on the Sabbath day from what bound her?" There's two main responses to the miracle of the healing that Jesus performs in this woman's life. There are probably more responses, but two and a half, I'm going to combine two, that are recorded here. And the first is praise. So immediately the woman is set free and she praises God and she goes out. And later in the passage, all of the opponents are humiliated, but the people were delighted. So there's two sort of immediate responses of praise. Praise happens when when we experience the goodness of God in our lives. So for the woman, there's a response of praise. For those witnessing it, there's a response of praise because either they've experienced it firsthand or witnessed it secondhand. God acting in humanity for the goodness of this lady, for life, toward life, performs a miracle, and there's an immediate response of praise, leaning in. Thankfulness for the experience of God's goodness in our lives and in the lives of others. But more importantly for us today to focus on, there's also this response of indignation, of anger. So the Pharisees respond. They see the healing, and I love Ish. It's like a love-hate relationship with their response. It says, indignant because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, they said to the people, there are 6 days for work, so come and be healed on one of those days. They're not angry that the woman was healed. They're angry with the way in which it happened. They're angry that it didn't happen according to their understanding of the law, according to their understanding of how God works, according to their interpretation of what is right and wrong. God acts into humanity. God acts on behalf of humanity. God heals this woman, and they're not even upset that she was healed. They're upset that it happened on the Sabbath. Jesus was acting outside of their understanding of the rules of religion. And so I read it and I see they're unable to comprehend a scenario in which it would be lawful to do work on the Sabbath. They can't see beyond the command simply to keep it holy. And they can't see toward the truth that God knew, that the Sabbath was always and only ever created to bring life. And that's why we get Jesus' response. You hypocrites, which of you didn't take your ox out to get water, right? Which of you hasn't done work? It would be as if you drop somebody off at the emergency. I mean, a little bit like this. It would be as if you drop somebody off at the emergency room because you're convinced they're having a heart attack, and the doctors and the ER nurses say, listen, there are 6 other days for you to come back and get healed. Come back on one of those days. And we read it and we say, hey, this is a moment that is always intended for life. And so Jesus calls them out of it, you hypocrites. Jesus calls them out of it. Hey, this is what the Sabbath was created for. Jesus calls them out of it. Hey, maybe your understanding of the law, maybe your interpretation of it isn't meant to put heavy burdens on people, but actually meant to bring life and meant to encourage. See, I think it's easy for us to stand on this side of the miracle and celebrate how Jesus healed the woman. And that's a good and right reading of this, and it is right to celebrate it. But I think that we can often miss the fact that Jesus here is making a very specific and very important statement about the world and about Sabbath, but also about the law and about gospel. It's a statement to the Pharisees about how they'd use their interpretation of the law to the detriment of those they were leading. Healing is more in line. If we read the full sort of understanding of what the Sabbath is and what it was designed for and how it was given, healing is more in line with the spirit of the Sabbath than following the letter of the law is in line with the Sabbath. And so I think all of it, the question that it brings us to today, as the church, for those of you who call yourselves followers of Jesus, for sure, this is something that we need to pay very close and specific attention to. It's not just simply, how are you going to go out and practice Sabbath? Though I do believe that if that's your only takeaway from today, that would be amazing. We need these rhythms that bring life. We need rhythms of grace. We need rhythms that point us toward God absolutely in your life. And so if all you do is go away and try to learn how to practice Sabbath a little bit more intentionally, that would be amazing. Beyond that, I think there's this invitation to really wrestle with how we respond to God's action in the world when it contradicts the way in which we expect God to act. Right? We need to think about how we react to God stepping into the world, even and especially when it dismantles our understanding of the limitations of how we think God ought to act. That often God is going to break in a way that brings life in places and spaces and in manners that we don't expect, and maybe even challenge the way we think God can or cannot act. The law was always meant to bring life. And so often we use rules to bind. And I think Jesus invites us to re-examine the spirit in which these laws are given and how the moment of Jesus' life and death and resurrection speaks to them. And then also to re-examine some of the rules that we have and maybe some of the ways that we've slipped into gatekeeping what Jesus has created for life. And so we can't just celebrate the healing, God's heart toward the sick, without also asking ourselves where we've created barriers to the gospel in our own communities of faith. And so again, I think the challenge to those of us who are followers of Jesus is to realize that you don't hold the keys to the kingdom. Jesus does. We don't hold absolute claim to truth. Jesus does. And we don't ever sit in judgment. Thank God Jesus does. The same one who steps in and uses moments like this to dismantle the things of religion for the sake of gospel. And so I want to ask you this morning, what might need dismantling in your life? And what might need dismantling in our church's life? And what could life look like if we intentionally chose to have some of those conversations and practice some of the disciplines in a way that brings life